I don't drink. I do all I can to keep you from drinking, and I shall do everything in my power to take the liquor stores off of the streets.
Welcome. I'm Ben Boyce. This is the Dr. Junkie Show. And today I want to talk about the early days of Prohibition, way back when the United States was so confused about drug policy that we thought we could keep people from drinking alcohol just by making it illegal. Okay, I guess we're still that confused about how drug policy works, but not with alcohol, at least not anymore. It's become much safer and less expensive since Prohibition was overturned in 1933. So let's talk about alcohol prohibition, and like I did with coffee a few episodes back, I want to take a dialectical approach to the history of prohibition in the United States, because it turns out that, like most laws that offer simple solutions to complicated problems, it actually made most of the problems that it claimed to solve worse. But before we get into the impact of prohibition, let's start at the beginning, way back in, say 10,000 BCE. This guy, let's call him Ugg. Ugg goes out scavenging for some food to bring back to his small family. He leaves his wife and 2 kids behind and signals that he'll be back before sundown. But sundown turns to pitch black and no sign of Pops. The next morning, after everyone's been up all night, hoping Ugg didn't get mauled by a lion or eaten by an anaconda, he comes traipsing back in, red-eyed, smelling like sweet grape juice that seems to be smeared all over his clothes, and he explains that he found some grapes that weren't quite rotten, and he ate them only to begin feeling woozy and lightheaded. He also claims he kinda liked the feeling. No big deal so far, right? We got this sweet grape juice that Ugg's drinking. It does more than just make him feel woozy and lightheaded. It makes him less inhibited. The more he finds fermented fruit to eat, the more he realizes that this disinhibition has a few benefits. For example, he can overcome some of his fears easier when he has a drink. Now when it's time to go hunting and he has to, say, cross through tiger country, he can take a few malted grapes with him. Liquid courage, right? Again, no problem so far, as long as he doesn't buffer his fear too much and get himself killed when he's too drunk to escape. That's the dialectic. Ugg has this tool that can help him work through human emotional hang-ups, but only in the proper dose and only at the proper time. He wouldn't want to slug down a batch of funny grapes before he had to run for his life from a predator, and he wouldn't want to consume so much of the stuff that he wakes up the next day feeling like shit. This thing that makes him feel great can also make him feel awful. The solution to some of his problems is, paradoxically, the cause of other problems. Now, don't forget that humans have more inhibiting emotions than just fear of tigers. Freud taught us that we spend the majority of our lives seeing someone we're attracted to across the room and then inhibiting ourselves from going over and, say, smacking his butt or asking him if he wants to get a room. We drive by 100 fast food restaurants with greasy, fatty, sweet treats, and we usually manage to repress the urge to stop and eat at every single one of them. Stick with your diet, Ben. We save for retirement instead of buying a new car every 6 months. We go on vacations that we never want to end, but then we force ourselves to come back home and go to work so we don't go broke. We exercise, we study, we work on our spirituality, all to the chagrin of our hedonistic selves who basically just want us to eat candy, watch YouTube shorts, and ignore all of the importance of deliberate, rational, principled morality. Boo. Alcohol works to disinhibit all of that stuff. It makes us more likely to smack that ass or to eat that candy or smoke that joint or quit that job. And that's where Prohibition actually originated, as a simple solution to the complicated problem of being a human in a world where a chemical can offer us an easy reward anytime. But that's kind of a cop-out, so let's fast forward, keeping in mind the fact that disinhibiting substances that put us in a state of mind where we're more likely to do that thing that maybe we shouldn't do, or more likely to say that thing that maybe we shouldn't say, that there'll always be a problem for some people. Namely, the person getting their ass smacked, or the business owner who has to deal with me quitting halfway through my shift. and for me when I do this thing that I later regret. So let's fast forward up to the year 1900. The United States is changing, and I mean it's changing. Fast and a lot. It's kind of wild to think about the concept of what we call pleasure as a new thing, but that's actually not all that far from the truth. For thousands of years, humans hadn't known what privacy was. There were no walls, no doors, not many enclosed spaces with soundproof barriers. Unless you were incredibly rich, you weren't living in a world where you could possibly develop the sort of habits that we now think of as addictions. Sneaking a joint before work in your car or your home, or taking a nip of brandy before church, or gambling, or masturbation, or secret sexual trysts. These things were rare and functionally difficult, actually, to pull off for most people until the late 19th century. But as our houses got doors and thicker walls, another pleasure-creating principle was also at work, this thing we call capitalism. One thing that usually doesn't come to mind when we think about this time is rubbing one out. David Courtwright tracks the popularization of masturbation through the early 1900s as fueled by an increase in technology that delivered a new method of pleasure to faraway places in the male. Pornography, which in essence led to greatly increased fantasies and a lot more time spent fantasizing and doing all the other things people do when they're fantasizing. At the same time, we had alcohol that was cheap, potent, and served everywhere in the 1900s. Drugs were this new invention that could switch on neural networks that, honestly, in the natural world were seldom tickled. Plus a trove of new toys, new methods of transportation, new technology, new industries. These things provided a massive list of new pleasures that actually hadn't existed in any form before that. Vacations to faraway places for normal people, leisure by way of recreational spectator sports that hadn't existed before, television and radio bringing this information and entertainment to anyone who could afford a receiver, and anything else in the new age of capitalism that was offered to humans who until that time had had relatively natural lives. Think about what life was really like before that. If it was January in Minnesota, you were probably about to spend the next 3 months staring out a window, if you had a window, and daydreaming about not much. Everything changed in the early 1900s. So that's where Prohibition really started, with a species of mammals, humans, encountering this relatively new environmental stimuli, which we really hadn't had much experience with prior to that. Strong distilled alcohol in large quantities, of course, but alongside other things that capitalism was offering. And in our struggle to navigate the evolutionary journey whereby we'll eventually land in some form of equilibrium down the road, we had some really big issues. It wasn't just the new pleasures, it was also the system of power normal in that day, industry. And as I've talked about a lot on this show, Henry Ford is just one example. He didn't want his workers smashed all day while they were running hydraulic presses and painting cars. Now, it's wild from our perspective to think about this now, but prior to the 1900s, workdays were usually 12 hours long, and they were often fueled by beer. Workers at factories would send a kid to get a bucket of beers first thing in the morning, then after lunch, then again at 3 o'clock. But Henry Ford comes along, and he normalizes this 8-hour work shift, largely because it was a short enough span of time that he felt like he could expect his workers to be fully engaged in their work, undistracted, and, hopefully, sober. The days of slamming beers on the factory line were over. Henry Ford, along with other bigwig moguls of the era like Rockefeller and Carnegie, they were a huge part of why Prohibition happened. They had the means to run ads in major newspapers or to get powerful politicians to parrot their anti-alcohol propaganda. The idea of prohibition came directly from the people capitalism propelled into power. But the idea of legally restricting alcohol, that took a bit more. It took the church and women joining forces to use the cultural stereotypes about both of those groups to their advantage and to shame alcohol drinkers and servers. So it's just before Christmas in the year 1900, and a woman named Carrie Nation comes charging into a saloon in Wichita, Kansas. And last night, when her husband came home drunk yet again and started getting abusive, It was the straw that broke the camel's back. Selling booze was already illegal in Kansas by then, so she starts smashing bottles of alcohol. And since she's a woman, the bartender doesn't really know what to do. So these smashing bar sessions, which Carrie cleverly called hatchinations, they grabbed the media's attention. They were spectacle. And Carrie was clever enough to use that media attention in her favor.
I solemnly promise, God helping me, to abstain from the use of all distilled, fermented, and malt liquors, and that means wine and beer. I don't drink, and I will do all I can to keep you from drinking. I think Prohibition will come back. Amen, amen, amen.
Her and other women across the United States, who couldn't vote at the time, they started grabbing their Bibles, putting on their Sunday best, and then walking as a group down to the bars in their towns, and then praying outside and begging God and the bartender to send their husbands home. Talk about media spectacles. So Carrie Nation becomes the public face of this movement, but she wouldn't have been that well known had it not been for those other new pleasure-increasing inventions that were going on at the same time. Photographs, newspapers, radio, and even movies. This was back when films included a news clip halfway through most shows while the workers changed the reels. Along with the new technology and fun toys, Carrie was facing one challenge that lots of women faced at the time. A husband who had stopped restraining himself from certain bad behaviors, like he'd lost his inhibition, and he was doing things like physically abusing his wife or blowing his weekly paycheck at the bar instead of paying his bills. And she didn't like it. So Carrie and her club made their argument, and at the time, it actually seemed like a pretty good argument. It went like this. It's 1910, folks, and we gotta recognize that things have changed. Number one, crime is on the rise. Social upheaval's changing things, and many people who had done just fine in a way of life they'd had for a long time, they're finding themselves suddenly updated into this new world where they better either change or die. A lot of these folks are resorting to drinking and drugging to ease their minds, and under the influence of these substances, her argument went, they're robbing people, fighting in public, abusing their wives. They're even participating in organized criminal activities. These drugs, in other words, they're making people into criminals. Sound familiar? Number two, said Carrie, alcohol was causing health problems. Not only were men getting hurt in fights and in accidents, but they were also drinking themselves into early graves. Outlawing alcohol, said Carrie and her temperance friends, that would reduce health problems. Number three, these drunk buffoons can't work, and because they can't work, they can't pay their rent. Even when they do work, a lot of them are blowing their paycheck at the bar, leaving their families hungry and homeless. Outlaw alcohol, and you can prevent lost wages. Argument 4. The early taverns weren't just bars. They were grocery stores, hangouts, churches sometimes, meeting halls, gambling clubs, and, after dark, they were places where you could purchase other services that intoxicated people often found themselves wanting to purchase, like sex work. Carrie didn't like her husband traipsing around with ladies of the night, so outlaw alcohol, she said, and prostitution will also decrease, since they go hand in hand. In argument 5, look at all these damn cops, said Carrie. We're overusing law enforcement to patrol and investigate all these crimes related to alcohol, and we taxpayers shouldn't have to shoulder that burden. Outlaw alcohol nationwide, and you'll be able to reduce your police budgets and the overall crime rate, went the argument. So there you have it. We got these 5 arguments that made sense to her audience, and she's got the spectacle of media pumping them out for her. And in January of 1920, this all comes together, and the 18th Amendment goes into effect, making it illegal to produce, sell, or transport alcohol anywhere in the United States. If you're paying attention, you notice that law allowed anyone who could, say, afford to stock up before it went into effect to keep drinking. That wasn't illegal. Classism always works best when it's mostly invisible, and this was classism built into laws in a way that you really had to squint hard to see. So there you have it, Prohibition in a nutshell. 5 solid arguments that led this country to outlaw alcohol. Number 1, the crime wave alcohol caused. Number 2, the health problems associated with it. Number 3, lost wages. Number 4, prostitution. And number 5, overuse of police. Those same arguments were what led to the abolition of Prohibition. So before we outlawed alcohol, the federal government's money came, in large part, from taxes on alcohol's importation. One of the policies that had to be enacted before Prohibition would work was income tax, which replaced a lot of that lost money from taxing alcohol. But income tax only works if people are working, if they're getting income. And in 1929, the stock market took the shit of shits. Things got bad, and the government suddenly found itself in desperate need of money. And to be honest, the public wasn't really digging this whole sober thing when things were going good. So now that the Great Depression was here, give us our booze, dude. This is America, and we've really never been a country that's big on following moral guidelines just because someone says so. We're outlaws who make our own way. And at this point, even elected officials had started to join the call to overturn the 18th Amendment, Mayor LaGuardia in New York being maybe the loudest and the most famous.
Prohibition cannot be enforced for the simple reason that the majority of American people do not want it enforced and are resisting its enforcement. That being so, the orderly thing to do under our form of government is to abolish a law which cannot be enforced, a law which the people of the country do not want enforced.
In 1932, FDR actually campaigned on a pro-repeal platform.
Washington, D.C. Roosevelt brings back beer and wine. By signing the Cullen Bill in a simple ceremony at the White House, the President has made it a law. It permits the sale of 3 2/10% beer and wine after April 6th, and in 23 states, the return of the foaming liquid at 5 cents a glass is assured. Rushed through the House and Senate, the measure marks the termination of a 14-year drought, ended by Roosevelt's prompt action.
At the same time, early bigwigs in the advertising world started creating campaigns meant to challenge the public perception of alcohol. And they did things like hold parades where men held signs that said, "I served my country, I deserve a beer," and "Beer for servicemen." They played on the pre-existing beliefs people had about specific groups. But the arguments these groups all made are what I find most interesting. The pro-repeal campaign settled on 5 key arguments, which you're about to find very familiar. Number 1, the crime wave that was caused from outlawing alcohol was out of control, and the only way to destroy the illegal alcohol market was to re-legalize and license it. Characters like Al Capone had become popular folk heroes, and the roots of NASCAR now run directly through a decade of bootleggers souping up their cars to outrun the police while they're hauling their hooch. When someone stole from these guys, much like a drug dealer today, they couldn't call the police. When someone moved in on their turf, they couldn't turn to licensing board or politicians or voters to fix it. They had to use violence in these situations so other would-be thieves or carpetbaggers would know better than to fuck with them. The spectacle of violence, well, it made the public angry. The crime wave has to be stopped. Re-legalize alcohol. Argument 2, health problems. Oh boy. When people were told they had to stop drinking, no surprise, a lot of them didn't. They just found their supply in any way they could. Sometimes the moonshiners who didn't know what they were doing would accidentally poison them. Sometimes industrial alcohol manufacturers who the government actually forced to put poison in their alcohol. Sometimes that would poison them. No one actually knows the exact number of people that were poisoned, but pyridine and benzene were just a couple of the poisons that the government would force producers to add to their products, and it would blind people and sometimes kill them. So all these health problems related to bad hooch, they could be prevented, the argument goes, if we just re-legalize alcohol. Argument 3, lost wages. The bootlegged liquor was expensive, and so were the legal costs associated with being arrested for alcohol-related crimes. And all of these health problems that came from drinking poisoned alcohol, they weren't cheap to treat either. So legalize alcohol, the argument goes, and the price will go way down, reducing lost wages. Argument 4, sex work. When Carrie's husband went to the tavern back in the day, he could find sex workers there. But now that her husband was going to an underground booze club run by Henry up the road instead of a licensed establishment downtown, the seedy nature of sex work got a lot seedier. If you want people to stop purchasing the services of sex workers, the argument went, re-legalize alcohol so they go to reputable establishments where we can outlaw sex work if we want to. And argument 5, surprise, we're overusing law enforcement. We're forcing them to chase bootleggers down back roads, creating expensive national alcohol enforcement units, busting up fights at the speakeasy. It's all too expensive. Let's legalize alcohol and we can avoid all of those expensive calls to law enforcement. So voila, you got 5 arguments for prohibition or for ending it. They're reversible. Sometimes I look at coffee the same way as I look at alcohol. I wonder what it would be like today if it hadn't been legalized. Like, would we all be guzzling down brake cleaner and taking smuggled in caffeine pills? How many people would die each year compared to now from taking contaminated products? How much would it be costing us? The cost of any drug simply existing, it'll never be zero. We're humans. We like to get high, we like to experience pleasure, and we're awful at doing good math about future consequences when it comes to temporary relief. What we did with alcohol is what we should do with all drugs for the exact same reasons. The crime from illegal sales and from desperate crimes committed by those trying to afford bananas prices right now, the health problems from polluted street drugs, the lost wages from both overpriced drugs and the jobs that won't let us work there if we use illegal drugs, the sex work that comes with the underworld market, the overuse of the goddamn police, it's all the same as it was with alcohol. So there's a quick trip down Prohibition Lane. I think Maddie is going to come back on and do a few episodes with me in the next few weeks, and she'll probably have something to add on this too, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce.
I'll fight the saloon from Hawaii to Hoboken. I'll kick it as long as I have a foot. I'll punch it as long as I have a fist. I'll butt it as long as I have a head. I'll bite it as long as I have a tooth. And when I'm old and fistless and footless and toothless, I'll gum it till I go home to heaven and it goes home, my friend, to hell.